There is a certain kind of woman who walks into a room and doesn't say much, yet something shifts. The energy changes. Conversations become slightly more tense. People who were relaxed just moments ago suddenly become careful, guarded, even distant. And the strange part is, she didn't do anything obvious to cause it. She's not trying to dominate. She's not seeking attention. She's not performing, impressing, or competing. And yet, she is often misunderstood, subtly excluded, quietly resisted. If you've ever experienced this, you might have asked yourself a difficult question. What am I doing wrong? But what if the answer is, you're not doing anything wrong at all? What if the real reason people react this way has nothing to do with what you do and everything to do with what you are? Carl Jung spent much of his life studying this exact phenomenon. He observed that individuals who move towards psychological wholeness, who begin to align their inner world with their outer expression, don't always integrate smoothly into society. In fact, they often disrupt it. Not intentionally, not aggressively, but simply by existing. Because when you become internally aligned, you become a mirror, and most people are not ready to see themselves clearly. As Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "The soul becomes dyed with the color of its thoughts." What he meant is simple but profound. Most people are shaped by unconscious patterns, habits, fears, roles they've been playing for years. But when someone stands in front of them who is no longer divided, no longer performing, no longer pretending, that contrast becomes impossible to ignore. And instead of reflecting, most people react. Not always openly, but subtly. Through distance, through tension, through quiet forms of resistance. So if you've ever felt like your presence alone creates discomfort in others, this video is for you. Because what you're experiencing is not random, and it's not personal in the way you think. It's structural, it's psychological, and in many ways, it's inevitable. In this video, we're going to break down 6 clear signs that you carry this kind of inner alignment, and more importantly, why each of them triggers resistance, discomfort, or even quiet hostility from others. Not so you can change yourself, but so you can finally understand what's really happening beneath the surface. Sign number 1. You sense incongruence before it's spoken. One of the first signs is something most people can't quite explain. You notice when something doesn't match. Someone smiles, but their body feels tense. Their words sound warm, but their presence feels distant. They say the right things, but something underneath feels off. And you don't need proof. You feel it almost instantly. This isn't overthinking, and it's not judgment. It's alignment. Carl Jung described this as the gap between the persona, the version of ourselves we present to the world, and the self, our true psychological reality. Most people live with a significant distance between the two. They say one thing, feel another, and suppress a third. And maintaining that gap requires constant effort, constant adjustment, constant performance. But you don't operate that way. Your inner state and your outer expression are largely in sync. You don't need to remember who you pretended to be 5 minutes ago. You don't rehearse emotions to be accepted. You don't shift your personality depending on who's in front of you. And because of that, you become incredibly sensitive to misalignment in others. Not because you're trying to detect it, but because you no longer carry that same internal split within yourself. And this is where the discomfort begins, because your presence exposes what others are trying to manage, not by calling it out, not by confronting them, but simply by being coherent. Epictetus once said, "If you want to improve, be content to be thought foolish and stupid." What he meant is this: the moment you stop performing for approval, the moment you stop adjusting yourself to fit expectations, you will no longer match the social script. And when you don't match the script, people don't feel safe around you in the same way, because now they can't predict you, they can't categorize you easily, and more importantly, they feel on some level that you can see through the version of themselves they've been carefully maintaining. And the human psyche does not respond well to that kind of exposure, not with reflection, but with defense. That's why the reactions are often indirect. People don't say, "You make me uncomfortable because you're authentic." Instead, you get distance instead of connection, politeness instead of warmth, gossip instead of honesty. Because it's easier to remove the mirror than to face what it reflects. So if you've ever felt like people become slightly guarded around you, like something shifts even when you say very little, it's not because you're doing something wrong. It's because you're no longer participating in the same level of internal contradiction. And that is something most people feel immediately, even if they can't explain it.
Sign number 2, you don't participate in emotional theater. Another clear sign is how you respond when emotions escalate, or more precisely, how you don't respond. When tension rises, you remain steady. When others get reactive, you don't mirror it. When drama appears, you don't feed it. You don't rush to fix, you don't perform exaggerated concern, and you don't get pulled into emotional chaos just to maintain connection. And because of that, people often misunderstand you. They say you're cold, distant, detached. But what they're actually encountering is something far less common: emotional self-containment. Carl Jung understood that much of human behavior is driven by what he called a kind of psychic hunger, a need to extract emotional energy from others in order to stabilize the ego. This is why drama exists, why conflicts escalate unnecessarily, why certain people constantly create emotional turbulence. Because reaction is a form of validation. It proves they matter. It confirms they can affect you. But when you don't react, you break that cycle. You create a kind of silence, a vacuum where their usual strategies no longer work. And to an unintegrated psyche, that silence doesn't feel peaceful. It feels threatening. Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this and you will find strength." In practice, this means something very simple. You are no longer governed by every external stimulus. Someone raises their voice. You don't automatically match it. Someone tries to provoke you. You don't feel the need to defend yourself immediately. Someone creates emotional intensity. You don't interpret it as something you must absorb. And this level of control creates distance, not because you're pushing people away, but because you're no longer available for emotional consumption. And that's where the projections begin. People may say, "You don't care enough. You're too distant. You should be more understanding." But if you look closely, those statements are not requests for connection. They are requests for access, your attention, your reaction, your emotional energy. And when you don't provide it, they interpret it as rejection, because they're used to relationships where emotion is constantly exchanged, amplified, and reinforced. But you've learned something different. Seneca once said, "We suffer more often in imagination than in reality." Most emotional chaos is not necessary. It's constructed, repeated, reinforced through habit. And when you stop participating in that pattern, you don't just protect your peace, you disrupt theirs. Because now they are left alone with emotions they don't know how to regulate without external input. So they label you cold, unresponsive, difficult. But the truth is much simpler. You're not withdrawing from connection. You're refusing to engage in emotional patterns that require you to abandon your center. And for many people, that kind of stability is far more uncomfortable than chaos.
Sign number 3. Your inner alignment is non-negotiable. At a certain point, this stops being about what you notice in others and becomes about how you relate to yourself. You don't betray what you feel. You don't ignore what you think. And you don't act in ways that contradict what you believe just to make things easier socially. There is a clear line inside you, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. Carl Jung called this process individuation, the integration of the self. It's the point where your inner world and your external behavior begin to align. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Very few people complete this process. Most people live in layers of contradiction. They feel one thing, say another, and do something completely different. Their values shift depending on the room. Their personality adapts depending on the audience. Their boundaries disappear when approval is at stake, because for them, adaptation is survival. But you no longer operate that way. When something feels wrong, you don't override it just to keep the peace. When something matters to you, you don't downplay it to be more acceptable. When a boundary is crossed, you don't pretend it didn't happen just to avoid discomfort. And this kind of internal consistency is rare, but it's also deeply unsettling to people who don't have it, because your stability highlights their instability. Your clarity highlights their confusion. Your consistency forces them to confront how often they abandon themselves. Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "If it is not right, do not do it. If it is not true, do not say it." Simple words, but extremely difficult to live by. Because following that principle comes with a cost. You will be seen as rigid, too serious, too intense, too uncompromising. Not because you actually are, but because you no longer bend in the same ways others do. And that creates friction. Epictetus also said, "Be not swayed by others' opinions. Be steadfast in your own reasoned judgment." What he's pointing to is this: the moment your internal compass becomes stable, external pressure loses its power. But for people who are still navigating life based on external validation, this feels threatening, because your presence silently communicates something they may not be ready to accept: that it is possible to live without constantly adjusting yourself to be accepted. So the criticism comes, but it rarely sounds honest. It comes disguised as concern. You're too closed off. You should be more flexible. You take things too seriously. But underneath all of it, the message is the same. Please bend so I don't have to question myself. And when you don't, when you remain steady without aggression, clear without explanation, and grounded without apology, you create a kind of psychological pressure that most people don't know how to resolve. So they try to reduce it, not by rising to your level of alignment, but by pushing you out of theirs. Which is why, over time, you may find yourself feeling separate, not because you're isolating yourself, but because fewer environments can accommodate the version of you that no longer negotiates with itself. And that's the real cost and the real power of inner alignment.
Sign number 4. You can't fake connection. Have you ever been in a conversation where everything looked normal, but inside you felt nothing? No real interest, no genuine connection, just emptiness behind the interaction. And no matter how hard you try,
You can't fake it. You can't manufacture warmth where your body feels resistance. You can't force enthusiasm when something in you knows it's not real. And over time, you stop trying. This is one of the clearest signs of inner alignment, because most people, whether they realize it or not, are constantly performing connection. They smile when they don't feel it. They engage when they'd rather withdraw. They mirror energy just to maintain social harmony. And on the surface, it works. But internally, it creates a split. Carl Jung referred to this as the formation of complexes, fragments of the psyche that develop when one part of you acts while another part withdraws. Every time you fake interest, override your intuition, or pretend to feel something you don't, you reinforce that division. And over time, that division becomes exhausting. But you've reached a point where that cost is no longer acceptable. So instead, you choose honesty. Not brutal honesty toward others, but internal honesty with yourself. If the connection isn't there, you feel it. If the energy is off, you don't ignore it. If something doesn't resonate, you don't force it just to fit in. And from the outside, this gets misinterpreted. People see your selectiveness and call it arrogance. They see your restraint and call it indifference. They see your silence and assume judgment. But that's not what's happening. You're not rejecting people. You're refusing to abandon yourself just to create artificial connection. Seneca once said, "Associate with those who will make a better man of you." What he's pointing to is the importance of quality over proximity. Not every interaction deserves your energy. Not every connection deserves to be maintained. And when you begin to live by that principle, your circle naturally becomes smaller, but also more real. Marcus Aurelius reinforced this idea in a different way. Waste no more time arguing about what a good person should be. Be one. Applied here, it means stop performing connection, stop imitating warmth, stop acting engaged when your internal state says otherwise. Just be aligned, and let that alignment determine where you stay and where you don't. Because the truth is, most people are comfortable in relationships built on mutual pretending. Unspoken agreements like, "I won't see through you if you don't see through me." But you've stepped out of that agreement, and once you do, you can't go back. Which is why your presence can feel unsettling, because now, without saying anything, you're breaking the illusion that everything is fine when it clearly isn't. And people don't resist that consciously, they just feel it, and they respond the only way they know how, by labeling you, distancing from you, or quietly pushing you out of spaces that depend on that illusion to function. But what they interpret as disconnection is actually something much deeper. You're no longer willing to trade authenticity for belonging.
Sign number 5. Your shadow is integrated. There's a part of human psychology that most people spend their entire lives avoiding. Not because it isn't there, but because it's uncomfortable to face. Carl Jung called it the shadow. The part of you that holds everything you've rejected, denied, or suppressed. Your anger, your envy, your selfishness, your fear, your capacity for harm. Most people don't integrate this part. They distance themselves from it. They build an identity around being good, kind, moral. And then, without realizing it, they project everything they don't want to see in themselves onto others. That's why judgment is so common. Why people label others as toxic, selfish, difficult, while remaining blind to the same traits within themselves. But you've done something different. At some point, you stopped running. You looked at the parts of yourself that weren't easy to accept. You noticed your own impulses, the ones that weren't always noble, the reactions that weren't always controlled, the thoughts that didn't fit the image you wanted to have. And instead of denying them, you acknowledged them. Not to act on them, but to understand them. to integrate them. And that changes everything. Because once you've faced your own shadow, other people lose a certain kind of power over you. They can't easily manipulate you with guilt. They can't destabilize you with projection. They can't expose something you've already accepted within yourself. Instead of absorbing their projections, you reflect them. And that reflection is deeply uncomfortable. Epictetus once said, "It is impossible for a man to learn what he thinks he already knows." Most people believe they know who they are. They see themselves as reasonable, as fair, as emotionally aware. But when they encounter someone who has actually done the internal work, who doesn't react, doesn't absorb, doesn't collapse under projection, that illusion starts to crack. And rather than question themselves, they push outward. They accuse, they criticize, they label. Not because you did something wrong, but because their usual strategy no longer works on you. Marcus Aurelius put it even more directly. If someone is able to show me that what I think or do is not right, I will gladly change. But here's the reality. Most people are not willing to do that. They don't want reflection, they want confirmation. And when they don't get it from you, they experience it as resistance, as distance, as something off about you. You may be called harsh, unkind, detached, but if you look closely, those labels often appear when their projections fail to land, because you're no longer carrying what doesn't belong to you. You're no longer internalizing other people's unprocessed emotions, and that creates a kind of psychological boundary that can't be easily crossed, which is why your presence feels different, not louder, not more aggressive, just solid, unaffected. And for many people, especially those who rely on projection to regulate themselves, that kind of stability feels almost impossible to deal with. So instead of adapting to it, they resist it, quietly, indirectly, but consistently. Because when the shadow has no place to land, it doesn't disappear. It turns back toward the one who carries it. And not everyone is ready for that.
Sign number 6. You carry a certain depth that others can't explain. There's something about you that people notice but can't quite define. It's not just how you look, not just what you say, not even just how you behave. It's something deeper, a kind of presence. You don't need to speak loudly to be felt. You don't need to explain yourself to be understood, at least not by everyone. But those who are paying attention sense it immediately. There's a weight to how you move through the world, a calmness that doesn't feel passive, but intentional. And often, people don't know what to do with it. Carl Jung described this as a connection to something beyond the personal self, what he called the collective unconscious, a layer of human experience that carries patterns, instincts, and inherited knowledge far deeper than individual memory. When someone is internally aligned, they don't just operate from surface-level reactions. They begin to perceive patterns. They recognize dynamics early. They sense outcomes before they fully unfold. They understand people without needing everything to be explained. And that creates a kind of psychological gravity. Not loud, not performative, but unmistakable. And here's the part most people don't talk about. That kind of depth is unsettling to those who live only on the surface, because your presence reminds them of something they've ignored, something they've suppressed, something they've disconnected from. Seneca once said, "The greatest wealth is a poverty of desires." What he's pointing to is a kind of internal sufficiency, a state where you are no longer constantly seeking external stimulation, validation, or distraction to feel complete. And when someone operates from that place, their presence changes. They're not restless,
They're not trying to impress. They're not chasing attention. And that stillness can feel intimidating. Marcus Aurelius expressed a similar idea. Nowhere can man find a quieter or more untroubled retreat than in his own soul. Most people don't have that. Their sense of stability depends on the outside world, on feedback, on reactions, on constant engagement. But when someone stands in front of them who is already grounded within themselves, it creates contrast. And contrast creates discomfort. Not because you're trying to stand out, but because you no longer need to blend in. You're not performing depth. You're not trying to appear wise or mysterious. You're simply not fragmented. And that coherence creates a kind of silent authority, which is why people often respond in subtle ways. They become quieter around you, more cautious, more self-aware, or sometimes they distance themselves entirely, not because you've done anything wrong, but because your presence requires a level of awareness they're not used to maintaining. And over time, you may notice something. The more grounded you become, the fewer people feel fully comfortable around you. Not because you're difficult, but because you're clear. And clarity, in a world built on distraction and performance, has weight. It has presence. And whether people understand it or not, they feel it.
Conclusion: the real meaning of being misunderstood. When you step back and look at all 6 signs, a pattern starts to emerge. This was never really about other people. It was about what happens when someone becomes internally whole in a world that isn't. You don't feel what others feel the same way. You don't react the way they expect. You don't participate in the same patterns that keep most interactions predictable. And because of that, you become difficult to categorize, difficult to control, difficult to read, at least on the surface. And the human mind doesn't like uncertainty, so it tries to resolve it. Not always through understanding, but often through simplification. She's too cold. She's too intense. She's too distant. But those labels say more about the observer than they do about you. Because what's actually being encountered is not coldness, not distance, not arrogance, but coherence. A person whose inner world is no longer fragmented. A person who doesn't need to split themselves into different versions just to function socially. Epictetus once said, "Don't explain your philosophy, embody it." And that's exactly what creates the tension. Because when something is embodied, it doesn't argue, it doesn't convince, it doesn't seek agreement, it simply exists. And that existence alone can be confronting. But here's the part that matters most. This is not a signal for you to adjust yourself to be more acceptable. It's not a reason to soften your clarity, to dilute your boundaries, or to return to patterns you've already outgrown. Because what you're experiencing is not rejection in the traditional sense. It's selection. A natural filtering process that happens when alignment meets misalignment. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "Waste no more time arguing what a good person should be. Be one." You don't need to convince anyone of who you are. You don't need to explain your presence. You don't need to earn understanding from people who are not operating on the same level of awareness. Your role is simpler than that, but not easier. To remain aligned, to remain aware, to remain grounded even when that creates distance. Because over time, something else happens. The same qualities that once created resistance begin to attract a different kind of connection. Quieter, more stable, more real. Not built on performance, but on recognition. So if you've ever felt misunderstood,
misread, or quietly pushed to the edges of certain spaces. Don't rush to correct the perception. Instead, pay attention to what it's revealing, because not every space is meant to hold you, and not every person is meant to understand you. Thank you for watching Stoic Wisdom today. Now, I'm curious, have you ever noticed people reacting to you in ways that didn't match your behavior? Subtle distance, unspoken tension, or being misunderstood without clear reason? Share your experience in the comments. And if this perspective helped you see things more clearly, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Because here, we don't chase approval, we build understanding. Until next time, stay calm, stay grounded, stay stoic.